Hey everyone, Omar here. Welcome back to the channel where I drop a new episode every Wednesday, and today we're going to cover something that's not only cool but incredibly practical. I'm going to show you how to turn pretty much any lens you have into a wide-angle lens, and I'm going to show you a practical use case scenario today. It's going to be the predominant B-roll, and it was when I shot this Palestinian mural that was down over at 600 T Street in Washington, D.C. when I was still living down in the area. The mural itself was done by two artists, Ahmed and Joel, and I will have links to both of their accounts in the video description below, because not only do I love this tribute to Palestine, which is currently experiencing an ongoing genocide being carried out by the Zionist state of Israel and financed by the US, I am not going to let that go, but also it is one of the first photos that's challenged me creatively in a very long time, partially because I was aiming to have a print, and when you have that mindset of, I want to take a photo worth printing, I personally have slowed down quite a bit and started to evaluate a number of things. Maybe that's worth its own video in the future, but also because this photo, this perspective right here, doesn't actually exist. And that's what makes today's video so topical. This copy is actually for Joel. I sent one out to Ahmed already before I moved, and what they don't tell you about buying photo printers is that they do not like being moved at all. I've got an older one, the Canon Pro 10, and it took me a while to finally get it to accept paper so I could make a print, and as a result, he's finally getting a copy, and you and I are finally going to talk about what it took to actually take this photo. This photo was taken about 6 months ago when I was still living in Northern Virginia. I heard that someone drew up a mural up in Washington, D.C., and I started seeing some shots of it on people's cell phones, but they were always at like a weird angle, and I didn't understand why no one was just taking a head-on shot of this mural. It didn't make any sense to me until I actually got there. So as you can see, the problem here is that this alleyway is way too narrow and you won't be able to actually get a shot even with an ultra-wide lens. So we have to stitch them. Again, as of right now, this mural is located at 600 T Street in Washington, D.C., and the alleyway is about 8 to 10 feet wall to wall, meaning that the furthest back a person could step is about 10 feet from where the mural was, and that clarified why people didn't have a head-on shot of it. I rode my bike there, and I had the Fuji 1024 mounted to my X-T5 there, and I also had my trusty monopod. I go everywhere with my monopod. Monopods are one of the most useful accessories you could have as a photographer, period. I will die on this hill. I always travel with a monopod because the extra height really does open up a lot of opportunities for some better photos. And I also always travel with a relatively inexpensive wireless trigger, which also comes in pretty handy. So here's the camera, here's the trigger, and this is just so you can see what's recording on screen. Links to anything I'm talking about will be in the description below if you want to grab any of it, but you can pretty much do this with any monopod and any trigger, whether it's cabled or not, as long as you can reach it. I thought I was going to be able to show up, take a shot, print it, and be done with it, but that was definitely not the case. Initially, I thought maybe I could fit the whole building in the frame, so I put my iPhone and switched the lens over to the Ultrawide, which is about a 13mm full frame equivalent, popped it up on the monopod, and I saw that I still couldn't even get the entire building in the shot, never mind any of the surrounding details. At this time, the Canon 10 to 20mm wasn't out yet, and it typically takes a while for any rental house to actually have one of those in stock for you to rent anyway, so I didn't have many options. And the Fuji 1024 is about 15mm full frame equivalent at its very widest, so seeing that the 13mm couldn't get the whole building, I knew I wasn't going to be able to do it with the 15mm, resulting in this process. What we're doing is called a panoramic stitch. You might have seen the panoramic setting in your phone's camera, or maybe you have a camera that has a panoramic mode in it, and essentially what we're going to be doing today is the manual process of putting that together. There are tons of benefits to this, mainly that you get a really high resolution photo at the end of the day, and it's also a raw photo, so it's very editable as well. This is a really common technique in landscape photography, and I just adapted it here to take the shot of this mural. After finding out that mounting the camera horizontally wasn't going to work out, I mounted my X-T5 vertically onto the monopod and connected the wireless trigger to it, tilted the screen down so I could look up and try to balance it as best I could. Because I really couldn't see the screen and I didn't have any means to have a remote monitor with me at the time, I set the camera to manual focus, stopped the lens up to f9 to make sure that I got a really nice crisp image. And now what I knew was going to be a problem was that because I was using an ultra-wide lens for this, I was going to deal with some distortion issues in post. As a photographer or videographer, there are going to be two types of distortion that you come across your entire career. First is going to be perspective distortion, which doesn't apply here, so I'm going to skip over it. But the second and most common kind is barrel distortion, which, as the name suggests, is distortion from the barrel, from the actual shape of the lens. Nowadays, modern cameras have a lot of digital corrections applied to all their lenses, so you may not actually notice much distortion. Really short explanation as to what barrel distortion is that the lines that are supposed to be straight in your image end up being curved. It's really rare for this to be an issue in the center of the frame, and it typically occurs at the outer edges. Between the digital corrections and the fact that you're not really looking at the edges of the photo, you'd be hard pressed to really notice it in most cases, but since we're shooting the side of a building and we want it to be as flat as possible and we're stitching multiple photos together, what's supposed to be the straight edge of the building is going to have a lot of half circle distortions, and that's what you have to keep in mind, because the more level you keep it throughout the entire shot, the less you're going to have to deal with correcting that as you do the stitch later on. Thankfully nowadays, software has made panoramic stitching a lot easier than it used to be, but you still have a couple of rules that you have to follow in order to have a successful stitch. The two things you're really going to want to focus on are staying level, like making sure that you minimize the camera moving up or down, meaning that I didn't just want to get the building in a shot, but I wanted to keep everything as centered and straight as possible to avoid having any dramatic distortion issues where the photos would be stitched. Let's call it the stitch line. So keeping it level is really important. The second thing you want to do is make sure that you're overlapping between 40 and 70% between each photo, meaning you have at least 40% and no more than 70% of essentially the same photo between each and every shot. This allows all the stitching software to kind of identify these common points and figure, all right, we're just going to cut and attach things here, and that really makes a huge difference in the end result. Too little and it just won't pick up that it's the same image. Too much and it's likely you'll get like a repeating pattern, like another layer of brick in the middle, for example, for this shot, and your panoramic stitch is just not going to turn out the way you want unless you start going in and doing a lot of manual corrections. Because I was using a monopod overhead, I made sure to overlap closer to the 70% marker because I knew it wasn't going to be as stable as it would be if I had one of those 20-foot tripods, which wasn't an option. They do exist, by the way. I did a complete pass across the mural, and I did like a really rapid check in the back, scrolling through the images just to make sure there wasn't too much up and down action going on. Absolutely knew I was going to have my work cut out for me, but it's been so long since I've done something different in photography that I was looking forward to the challenge. Hey guys, Future Omar here. One of my buddies said to tell everyone to like and subscribe in the middle of the video, so this is me doing exactly that right now. And now back to the video. I went home, popped the photos onto my laptop, and I use Capture One. I find that their stitching tool, at the time at least, was a lot better than it was in Lightroom. But also, if you're a Capture One user and you've noticed the software get worse and worse and worse as time progressed, especially over the past year, it's because they were bought out by private equity. They laid off a bunch of people. Prices have gone up. I'm really concerned for that software because they're clearly not prioritizing the user and the innovation that they had prior. If you're a Lightroom user, you can definitely still do this in Lightroom, and there are some standalone softwares that do this, like outside of the Adobe and Capture One ecosystem. They exist just to merge photos for panoramic stitches and some HDR merges too. I think those are like the main features of those specific softwares. And the steps are the same for all of them, so feel free to follow along. It's just your menus are going to look a little different. Like I said, it's a lot easier these days than it was in the past. All I did was select my photos, right-clicked and said, give me a stitch, and this is what it churned out. Not exactly what I had in mind, but you know, it was something I could definitely work with. Pulled it into Photoshop, and it's the perspective that I had to change. The perspective obviously was like super crazy and stretched out. So I just made a couple of adjustments. I essentially lined up all the lines that I knew were relatively straight, which were the edges of the building, and I corrected that, but it left the world around it kind of distorted, and I started to correct that, but then made the executive decision to kind of leave it alone, because it felt like the aesthetic was really cool. And most of my work is like documentary and product. Essentially, everything is just really grounded in reality. And because I was aiming for a print and it was like a fun process and it was someone else's art project and I'm making my own art for it, I decided to leave that distorted world intact, and I think it came out pretty well. I ended up doing a sky replacement just to give the building some breathing room. It was a really overcast day, so it was just going to be some white space above anyway. But I went with one of the default sky replacements, added a little Gaussian blur, and it was good to go. I printed the image out. There were a couple of failures. I ended up going with the Canon Pro Platinum paper, if memory serves me right, and just because it displayed really nice where I was planning on hanging it at the time. And I was really happy with the end result. Did a little reel on Instagram and TikTok on it because I was having some fun with it. And that's when it gradually got to one of the artists who was like, wow, that's a great shot. And it hit me like I should probably just send them a copy. Why not? This is their work, you know? And that's really the whole story behind it, but that's how I was able to take an ultra wide shot with I don't even know what millimeter lens you would need to take a shot like that, just using the lens I had on hand. And this isn't just limited to this camera setup, obviously. You can do this with your phone. You can do this with a point and shoot camera. If you've got a fixed focal length point and shoot camera like the Fuji X100 or 6 or a Ricoh GR, you can take a couple of shots and stitch them together in post, and then suddenly your 40mm lens can take the same shots as, you know, an 8mm or something. You can also take some really cool creative portraits this way, and maybe someday if I find a volunteer up in North Jersey to actually sit through that process with me, I can go over it and show people how to do that. But you can end up getting a photo that looks like a medium format, like an APS-C camera can easily get a photo that looks like a medium format camera, and if you use like a medium format camera like the GFX 100, you can really do a good job replicating the large format look that way. Absolutely 1000% unnecessary, but I mean, it's fun. It's our hobby, it's our profession. Why not? And in truth, you'll never know when that knowledge is going to end up solving a problem, because that's really all creativity is. It's just problem solving within a set of constraints. Usually those constraints are money and, you know, practicality, but problem solving is problem solving. With that being said, that's the end of this episode, and I'll catch you at the next one.